Hi, my name's Luke Meduna. I'm the Big Game Program Manager for the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. Thanks for joining me on my discussion or proposal for the some of the reorganization of our elk management units that we're looking at and want to discuss with the public and get your input on for this upcoming 2023 season. For a little bit of historical background and context, this is our map of our current elk boundaries. You can see we've got elk units basically covering the western 2/3 to 3/4 of the state. Some of those units are quite large, like the box elder, which is about 26,000 square miles. About a third of the state area is encompassed in that box elder unit at this point. But to take a step back, look at some of our history, you can see historically, when we started our elk management, our units were pretty narrowly focused around those areas where we had elk, like in the Hat and Bordeaux. That Boyd unit that was a cooperative agreement with South Dakota in '96, and then in 2003 when we added the box elder, again it was a pretty narrow area around the Les Canyons in Lincoln County. Similar when in '04 when Ash Creek was added, but then in 2006 the North Platte River unit was a little bigger, but we did have elk spread across a pretty large area up and down that valley and across the southern panhandle. In 2007, when we added the Niobrara, that was kind of the first of our big bulk units where we encompassed everything, basically the entire northern Sandhills. And we did expand the Bordeaux unit heading east over to Highway 27 that same year. In '08, we expanded the box elder unit to encompass most of southwest Nebraska outside the Les Canyons as we started to see elk spreading outside the canyons there. And then in '09, all the panhandle units expanded to fill in those gaps. You can see that change where there were significant portions, probably about half of the panhandle wasn't included in an elk unit. In '09, then we expanded it to include all of them. In 2013, the reciprocal agreement with South Dakota was terminated. So then it was just a lone Boyd unit permit there for about 6 years until we split the Niobrara and absorbed the Boyd into the Niobrara East unit. That Niobrara East and West split was just to help us manage some of the differences between the east end and west end of that large original Niobrara unit. In 2021, we expanded the box elder unit over to Highway 281 to help us encompass some of those elk herds that were starting to pop up. Like we've got some down around Alma and out kind of up and down the Republican River Valley, as well as increasing numbers of elk in Custer County, and all that was east of 183 that we were looking at. So as you can see from the map here, this is the map of our harvest and our units over the last 3 years. You can see how most of our harvest typically tends to land in those areas where we've historically had higher numbers of elk. We found it's been increasingly difficult to try to push hunters into those areas of lower elk density, which that's not to blame hunters at all. It's a highly sought after permit. Some of them, the bull is one harvest in a lifetime. Obviously, you're going to want to go where there's higher densities of elk and higher chance of killing an elk and less work to do so. But part of this that we're looking at is trying to address some of that. So you can see how that distribution is. In particular, the one area where we've been able to get harvest outside of that has been Keith County, and that's taken an incredible amount of work from our staff and landowners to try to push and get hunters into that area to try to help and harvest elk during our regular seasons. So looking at what we're proposing is looking at dividing the state up into 14 separate units. So the entire state would be encompassed in a management unit. We would narrow those historic units down kind of back to some of what they were previously, just more narrowly around where we've got elk and elk habitat. We'd also provide ample permits in those new units to manage the expansion of elk herds in some of those undesirable areas. Ultimately, it's about having the right number of permits out there to help us manage elk, based upon those social tolerances. We're really not proposing any changes to the way permits and quotas operate under our past format. We're still going to have limited bull permits, limited cow permits, good for an area, still going to do a drawing, all that type of stuff. None of that's changed. One of the things we're looking at, whether or not we'd go with, keeping the historic names, or just moving straight to numbers. There's pluses and minuses to both of those. The only real difference that we're looking at or discussing right now as far as unit structures would be that what we're referring to on the map here would be unit 14, that eastern part of the state where we really don't have existing elk or elk habitat. And what we're kind of looking at doing is allowing it not having a permit quota for that unit, but making it so that the valid permits in the other 13 units would be valid in that unit. So with the number of hunters that we have in the eastern part of the state, if you know somebody, or while you've got that your permit for Hat Creek or whatever permit you might have, that it would also be valid for unit 14. So if you come across one of those incidental elk, whether you're normally hunting or somebody calls you and says, hey, there's this opportunity, then that elk would be open to harvest. Just so part of that is just so we don't put a lot of, put permits out there and then have a year when we don't have any elk in the eastern part of the state, because that's going to be really hard to predict. So that's one of the things we're discussing. Obviously, nothing's finalized yet. We're trying to get everybody's input on it. That's the purpose of the video here. So our goals for this are to provide permits and focus the effort in these new elk areas to help better manage those populations. It would just be a forced hunter redistribution to some of these lower density elk areas. It also gives us the potential to put more pressure in areas of crop damage if that's needed. It also just gives us a better distribution of permits to deal with some of those problem areas, instead of trying to push hunters to some of those areas. That's the area where they're getting their permit for. And it also, like I mentioned, allows harvest statewide. It allows hunters to utilize those wandering elk instead of removing them if and when they cause trouble. The big part of this is this is a step to try to make sure that hunters are part of our solution in helping solve any of our elk problems as much as we can possibly do. Some of the potential side effects with this, I think in some of these new areas, we can expect lower success rates and bull quality metrics, maybe a little lower. And so those units, but at the same time, we're planning on addressing those unit by unit based upon social tolerances anyway. So we've already kind of taken some of those steps. So it's not a lot different there, but just some expectations from what the hunters may have. If it's not a great elk area, it's probably not going to be as quality of a hunt. It could potentially redistribute some of the draw odds. Some of those new units may have, better draw odds, but lower success in permits. Because it's gonna be a tougher hunt. There's gonna be a lot more homework that needs to be done, because there's not just an area that you can just point and say, or necessarily that there's a place that you could point and say, oh, that's where the elk are, because they tend to be a little more transient, a little harder to find, not as high in numbers. So there's gonna be some changes there. We could also have, additional, lost hunters that draw on these permits that don't know where to start in some of those new units, but we already kind of deal with some of that already. The reorganization of the units will also separate some of the peripheral landowner zones from those core landowner zones. As elk have popped up elsewhere, the landowner zones tend to pop up. These are the areas that are eligible for the limited landowner elk permits. But then, those historically, those permits have also been valid in the core area or the historic area where those where the large numbers of elk are. So some of those people, some of those landowner units will be filtered off. You won't get a hunt where there's lots of elk, but at the same time, their odds of drawing a landowner permit will go up. So there's going to be some changes there. It'll also help us, there's some potential to reduce the need for a special depredation season. It'll fill in some of these gaps. And like I've mentioned, it's just a matter of trying to push hunters into some of these areas where we're wanting them to hunt and help us and help the landowners out, help manage these elk populations. So yeah, as far as public input, again, if you need some reviewer, please watch this video again. Take a look at the maps. There should be some listed on the website just so you can kind of see. Provide input through the comment form. Send that to me. That will actually go into an email that comes straight into my inbox. So I'll try to respond to every comment that we get, just so you know that it's been received. We'll look at all those comments here over the next couple months. We'll review all the comments and input. We'll specifically work with landowners in some of those potential problem areas where some of those lines need to be drawn, a little more carefully. So we'll be reaching out. I know a lot of staff has already started to do some of that. And then when we get all that input, we'll discuss that with our commission and the administration. And if we decide to go forward, if this is something we want to pursue, then we'll look at making changes to the orders at the April commission meeting, and we should be have everything in place, permits and quotas and all that for this upcoming year. So I guess please stay tuned. We'll try to keep everybody updated, through our regulatory process like we normally do. We put out, our proposals this spring. But like I said, if you got input, please provide it. If you got questions, let me know. I'll do my best. Obviously, the boundaries here are very preliminary and initial. There's probably going to be a little bit of tweaking here and there, but we'll try to follow. Roads are easily definable areas. So I guess if you have questions, let me know. Thanks for joining me, and have a great day.